After the Boston Massacre, we have a period of calm where the people in Britain seem to think that everything is okay, that they've undone all the problems, and the colonies will go back to the way they were. But in America, there's actually a conversation going on about what they believe to be the limits of royal authority. This comes from a lot of different sources. First, we have the Puritans, who, of course, originally came over here to escape royal authority. And they have their own ideas about self-governance they've developed over the last 150 years or so here. The Scotch-Irish, the Scotland and England have a long history of England trying to oppress Scotland, and there were many Scots in America, and they weren't that predisposed to accept royal authority anyway. Country Whigs, this had been the group that had been in power before George III had come to the throne, and were angry at George's increased role as king. And finally, the teachings and the writings of John Locke, the great philosopher of the English Civil War, who had said that authority comes from the consent of the people, not from God. And all these began, a lot of very intelligent, very educated, and very powerful people in America began to absorb all these ideas. The belief at the time was that people were essentially evil and would be corrupted by power. And so it became simple that the king had all the power, therefore the king couldn't help but be corrupt. They also believed that what they saw as England's distribution or separation of powers was the ideal setup. You had a king, then you had the wealthy represented by the House of Lords and Parliament, and then you had regular people represented by the House of Commons and Parliament. But they believed that the king had become so corrupt and powerful that he had stripped the power away from the other two. That is to say, the king had overpowered Parliament. The colonists also, by now, every colony had a written constitution. And the colonists began arguing that England needed a written constitution because the king had simply changed the rules of government because England didn't have a written constitution. And so that was another topic of conversation. Another issue is the idea of virtual representation versus geographic representation. And this is a question of, in England, the members of Parliament didn't necessarily come from the different parts of England. They could all be from London, for example. And the British would argue that any member of the empire could represent all members of the empire, whether they lived anywhere near them or not. And the Americans began to argue that you really could only be truly represented by your neighbor because every location had its own specific interest. This is called geographic or actual representation. So they began to reject the British parliamentary system, saying that doesn't represent us here in America because none of the people in Parliament, of course, are from America. There also began to be a discussion about unitary versus federal government. A unitary government is when there's one level of government. All there is the national government. A federal government is a government with layers. So in this case, you had a national government in Britain, then you have Parliament. Then you had the colonial assemblies underneath it. And the colonists began to argue that they needed a local government, the colonial government, as well as a national government. These ideas were spread in letters, leaflets, pamphlets, the early and fairly primitive newspapers, and books. And often they would be talked about in taverns or the bars of the day or restaurants. And many men would kind of go to the tavern after working all day and spend the night drinking and talking about these ideas, particularly in New England. Every New England town had a tavern, and the men would gather there when they were done working in the fields and discuss this stuff. The only real episode during this period between the Boston Massacre and the Tea Party is the Gaspee Affair. And this is where a British tax ship gets a little too close to the coast and gets stuck on a sandbar, and citizens of Rhode Island sail out and burn it in protest of its collecting taxes. We need to understand the Boston Tea Party. And it's not what most people think. And in fact, if you look at the recent phenomenon of the Tea Party, there's a great irony here because the Tea Party is protesting taxes, or at least they started that way. Whereas the Boston Tea Party was actually protesting a tax cut. So why would you protest a tax cut? Well, let me explain. The British East India Tea Company was a company that sold tea throughout the British Empire. And it was largely owned by members of Parliament. Guys who were actually in Parliament were the investors. And it was going broke. It wasn't making any money. It was a failed business venture. And so members of Parliament, wanting to line their own pockets because they own the company, decided to use their power to pass laws to rig the system to make it profitable. And so what they did was in 1773 with the Tea Act, they said that British East India Tea Company would be exempt from the tea tax in an attempt to cut its price and force people or encourage people to buy that tea so they themselves could make money. This was not in the interest of England, this was the interest of the members of Parliament. Of course, in England they thought, well, the colonists would love this because now they would have the opportunity to get cheaper tea. But the colonists saw this for what it was. They saw it as a corrupt attempt to manipulate policy to line the members of Parliament's pockets. And so all throughout the colonies, not just in Boston, but all 13 colonies boycott the tea. And in fact, the group, the Daughters of Liberty, is founded to and enforces boycott. In Philadelphia and New York City, they surround the ships when they come into the harbor and refuse to let them unload the tea. In Charleston, they unload the tea into a warehouse and then lock the warehouse up and don't let any of the tea out. In fact, not a single bag of the British East India Tea Company tea is sold in the colonies, so effective is this boycott. But the most spectacular and the most famous incident here is on December 16th of 1773, when a group of wealthy, well-known Boston citizens poorly disguise themselves as Native Americans, drink a lot, and go on to the ship in Boston and throw the tea into the harbor, which is to say they destroy a lot of money's worth of members of Parliament's tea. As you can imagine, the MPs get angry, and they pass the Coercive Acts of 1774. And they essentially strip the power from the Massachusetts Assembly. They order that people arrested in Boston will return to England for trial because they don't want them tried in front of colonists who might let them off. They order the citizens of Boston to quarter troops in their homes. They closed Boston Harbor. At the same time, unrelated and coincidentally, they will pass the Quebec Act, which expands Canada into the Ohio River Valley and also guarantees the right of Catholics to freedom of religion. Many colonists see in this Quebec Act a popish plot, a plot to help the Catholics take over America. Since it's passed at the same time as the Coercive Act, this just heightens the paranoia. The intent of the Coercive Acts, or as the Americans call them, the Intolerable Acts, is to isolate Massachusetts and make the other colonies turn against Massachusetts. But this doesn't work. In fact, the other colonies unite in support of Massachusetts, realizing they could be next. Virginia created an intercolonial committee of correspondence. Remember, Sam Adams had created one in New England, and now Virginia will get involved, and people all over the colonies will begin writing letters to each other about ideas about this impending revolution, including Thomas Jefferson. This is where he kind of enters the scene. The royal government disbands the Virginia House of Burgesses, but the Virginia House of Burgesses keeps meeting at a tavern, even without royal authority. And in September of 1974, we have the First Continental Congress. 12 of the 13 colonies come. Georgia doesn't come, maybe because it was too far away. The First Continental Congress does the following. It rejects a British plan to unite all the colonies under one government. It sends a moderate statement of grievance to the king. It asks for the repeal of all legislation since 1763. And it begins to prepare an army for a potential attack from Great Britain. It creates the Continental Association to enforce a boycott, and they agree to meet again the next year. Lord North, the Prime Minister of England, sends an offer to let the colonial assemblies decide how they'll be taxed. But this doesn't reach Lord North until after the shooting has started. The Minutemen in New England had been hoarding guns and ammo for months in preparation for a potential war. The British general in charge in Boston knew his army was too small to resist the Minutemen that were organizing. And his name was Gage. And he was constantly trying to keep the peace in Boston. In fact, at one point he's ordered to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, and he simply refuses to do so, knowing it will start a riot. But when the rebels stockpile a lot of gunpowder, most of it stolen from the British Army, by the way, at Concord, Massachusetts, which is right outside of Boston, Gage realizes he has to go get it, or else he's risking a rebellion. And so on April 18th of 1775, about 1,000 British men march out in the middle of the night, and a man named William Dawes, a doctor, and Paul Revere, the printer, will ride out and warn the Minutemen, who will, of course, wake up, come out in the middle of the night, and line up in Lexington, which is between the military base and Concord, to meet the British Army. In this first action of the war at Lexington, 8 colonists are killed and 10 are wounded, and the British Army is unharmed. But when the British Army gets to Concord that morning, of course the colonists have already moved the gunpowder, so there was no point in going there in the end anyway. And then the British Army has to march back in the morning. And on the march back, the colonists will hide behind fences and will use guerrilla tactics. They will shoot from cover, hit and run, these sorts of things. And they will kill over 24 British soldiers. And nobody knows it yet, but the American Revolution has now begun. And also nobody knows who fired first, by the way. They call it the shot heard around the world. And nobody knows if it was a British soldier or an American militiaman who fired it. But it really is a shot heard around the world because, and here's what's probably most significant in world history about the American Revolution. It was the first time in history, in modern history anyway, that a colonial power had decided, had taken action to throw off its European master. And of course, really up until today, we'll see that happen all over the world, in South America, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East. And so this is the beginning of the end of colonialism. And that's why it's the shot heard around the world. And that's why this incident is so incredibly important.